Hello and welcome to today's episode of Footnotes. Today I am joined by Amber Rose Washington. She is an author, songwriter, musician, producer, public speaker, and advocate for the transgender community and has been featured on Fox, NBC, CBS, NPR, and a host of other media, now including my little podcast here. Her new podcast, The Journey Unscripted, is scheduled to begin airing next month in June of 2021. Amber grew up in Liberty, New York, a small town in the Catskill Mountains. Her town and region were the inspiration behind the movie Dirty Dancing. The Catskills are well known by the Hollywood elite as the place where so many celebrities of the past got their big break, and you can experience a glimpse into this region in the Netflix original series, The Marvelous Mrs Maisel. Her early accomplishments include working in the mid-90s as a music arranger and co-writer on an exhibit that brought attention to the children of Africa, most notably in Ethiopia. After traveling to over 150 countries, this exhibit would find its home in the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. She had her true introduction into the music business from the late Ann Ruckert, who was the vice president of the board of governors of the Grammys and vocal coach to the top names in the industry. While she wrote many genres of music, it was her smooth jazz that people would come to recognize. Before coming out, Amber also worked with several cast members of HBO's The Sopranos and the movie Goodfellas in the capacity of producer. She has also worked with numerous mainstream music recording artists as a national and regional TV and radio voiceover artist, stage management, and live concert introductions in New York, Los Angeles, and Nashville. Amber has also worked with the Kids WB, Court TV, and a host of other media organizations. Her music has been heard on the Weather Channel, 5-star hotels, smooth jazz radio stations, the Smithsonian, and a #1 track on the UK's independent country crossover charts. She always surrounds herself with incredibly successful and influential people, from songwriters and musicians to Hollywood actors and screenwriters. And she attributes her final amassment of courage that would allow her to finally live her life authentically to former President Barack Obama, who helped begin the real conversation about people born transgender. Amber currently lives in Florida, where she and her team are currently building out her platform, which will allow her to bring greater awareness to the diversity of the human condition. This platform will also facilitate innovative and educational speaking engagements and interactive lectures at college universities, pride events, radio, internet-based podcasts, TV interviews, and article-based media. She currently performs outreach to numerous regional transgender support groups in the United States and beyond. Amber's book, Hiding From Myself, climbed to #2 on the bestsellers list in multiple categories and in several countries. And it's important to note here, because it has much to do with the subject of this podcast episode, that she belongs to one of the most marginalized demographics in the world, representing 0.7% of the human population. So today, we're going to talk about what you didn't learn and what I didn't learn about the trans experience. When I started the recording, it kicked me out for some reason, but we're back. Okay, great. Amber, I would like to kind of start things off. I would like to get kind of like a synopsis or an autobiography of you in terms of because the things that you've been able to accomplish are just incredible. And I think this is an opportunity to provide inspiration for people who see figuring themselves out and knowing themselves maybe as a barrier to making incredible external accomplishments, which is something that you've done. And so I'd like to kind of get a view of what's important to you, different projects that you've worked on, and things like that leading up to your book, which reached #2 on Amazon's bestseller status. Congratulations, by the way.
Thank you.
You're welcome, which is all about that journey anyways. And so I'd like to kind of explore that with you.
Absolutely. The first thing I guess that I will say is that I have a very, very complex career path that I've taken. So I'll try to give the summarized version of the things that I've been able to do, all while overcoming adversity, both from a health perspective, a medical perspective, and from being born incongruent, being born trans. So let's hop right to it. So when you're born like I was, and I like to use the word incongruent, which means there's a congruity issue. So to your listeners or anybody else listening, most people, 99.3% of the human population, are born congruent, which is to say their bodies and their brains match up perfectly. In other words, in the first trimester of pregnancy, your body and your reproductive organs start to differentiate. In the second trimester of pregnancy, a lot of people aren't aware of this, your brain actually starts to physically differentiate. If you study neurology or the human brain, you'll notice that the, they don't really call it a male and female brain, but for just to keep things uncomplicated for this show, that's the way I'll refer to it, even though it's not exactly accurate. But when you look at the cortical region of the brain in a female, or a trans female for that matter, it's typically thick. It's got a thick lining. When you look at a male, that cortical region is thin. And so there's a physical, there's part of this is the physiological aspect. So the physiology of the brain is actually constructed differently with females than it is for males. Same for trans women and trans men. So they use this word, identify with, right? So people would say, oh, she identifies with being female. I don't identify with anything. I hate that word, right? So there's a lot of words floating around that where trans people themselves even use, I identify as. Well, that's kind of a silly thing. And I'm one of those people in the elder community that is sort of pioneering this change of nomenclature, if you will. Because how many times, Marcus, has someone come up to you and say, so how do you identify? They just, if you're wearing a mask on your face or whatever and nobody can see who you are, they don't say, what do you identify as? They said, are you a man? Are you a woman? Are you both? Are you neither? Whatever the question is. So I like to tell people that I'm just a woman. I'm not, I'm not somebody that identifies as something. That sort of lends itself to being a little disingenuous, as if it's some sort of choice. Like later I can identify as, something else, and that's just not how it works for me. And so what I want to do is talk to people about there's physical differences in our structures when we are in utero. So before we're born, these things happen to us. We don't exactly know why, although scientists have already identified up to 20 genes or genetic markers that could be responsible for this to happen. So when you look at the statistics, 0.7% of the population, which refers to me, that's people 18 and above. When you look at people from 0 to 18, there's no real valid statistics on that because, well, just because of our country, we have not allowed people to really take valid statistics on that. But we've been able to get a fairly accurate scientific count on that. And it's basically doubling that 0.7%, which means approximately 1.7% of people are born transgender. And approximately 1.6% are born intersex. Do you happen to know what that word means?
I do not know what intersex means, no.
So intersex is an interesting thing as well. So before I get into that, we should all be aware that there are hundreds of thousands of different types of birth anomalies out there in the world, right? We're familiar with being born deaf, or being born blind, or being born with a congenital heart defect or cleft palate. And there's a whole myriad of those types of anomalies that happen to individuals that are born. We can all agree on that, correct?
Right.
So another one of those anomalies is people that are born intersex, which means they have both sets of genitalia, or they have ambiguous genitalia, which means it's not exactly formed in one or the other, or they have varying degrees of both. For example, I'm not going to name names. I know people that have a uterus, a prostate, and a penis, right? And I know people that have a vagina, right? And testicles. I mean, there's all sorts of anomalous things that happen. Some people argue, well, that's because you have XX female, XY male, but it's actually a little more complicated than that, because I know people that are XY that those folks from fourth grade biology would say that's a male. Well, their reproductive organs are, they have a uterus and a penis. How do you explain that with just those dynamics? So being born intersex, there's actual physical characteristics with the reproductive organs. So we call that term intersex. Way back in the day, that was called hermaphrodite. But that's actually considered a derogatory term, right? We don't
Right.
we use that term because society took that word and twisted it into a million disgraceful ways. So it's called intersex. That's actually the medical term that folks that are born intersex are. I was not born intersex. However, what they may start finding out is because of the physical differences in someone like me, that it actually could be related to that because you can see those reproductive organs on people, but you can't see that on me. The largest reproductive organ in the body that's responsible is the human brain. You can't see my brain. And secondly, people that were brought up in my generation had to endure a puberty that was incorrect. So if you're assigned male at birth and then you're forced to go through the wrong puberty during those ages, you end up with physical deformities, I'll call them. Your bone structure changes, your voice gets deeper, your vocal folds get thicker and elongated, you get muscles, you get hair growing out of everywhere. It's gross, right? So, well, at least for me it was. So,
It was gross for me too.
so, you know, society has a way of stigmatizing or stereotyping certain things. And we've been doing this for forever in humanity. And the stigmatism that happens is when we see somebody that has gone through the puberty the wrong way, and in this case, we'll say someone that was assigned male at birth, but it's really female, like myself. When you go through puberty the wrong way, we spend the rest of our natural lives trying to undo that permanent damage, right? We go through a lot of painful procedures and whatnot just to be congruent and to fit in, right? So that's an issue for us. And 40 years ago, they came out with something called puberty blockers. Now, all of a sudden, you see it in the news, and there's certain states trying to ban it and whatnot. And 99.9% of the people out there think this is like something new. Oh my God, what are they doing to these children? They don't understand that, number one, we've been using this stuff for 40 years. Most of us, like I grew up in a very small town in upstate New York. I didn't have access to this stuff. We had no internet growing up. I thought I was the only human being struggling with this, quite honestly. And so if you allow a child to have a puberty blocker administered, and the child I'm talking about is a transgender child, and once again, we're talking about 0.7% of the human population. Nobody arbitrarily just wakes up one day and says, oh, I'm going to be a girl today. That's not how this works. You're either born transgender or you're not.
Can I jump in and ask a question? Because I think that I want to touch on kind of two like subsets maybe of people based on like the kind of like neurological discoveries that you're talking about when you're talking about the male brain and the female brain, to use those, like you said, the simplified terms. If we reach a point, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think you mentioned like if we were to reach a point in the future where we could tell more easily like what genes or what kind of differences in the brain would be linked to this to the trans phenomenon, really. And I wanted to ask kind of what happens if we reach that point where that's kind of commonplace to people who, and I'm going to use the term identify here just to separate this group a little bit from like but what happens to people who would say like I identify as a woman or identify as a man, I am a woman, I am a man, but then like later find out that they didn't have those genes or didn't have that kind of brain difference? Or on the other hand, like people who like maybe find out that they do and then never like realized it or dealt with it in a way that was helpful to the reproduction to them. Like is that a tragedy? Like what happens to those groups of people in this future?
So, really, realistically, explaining a neurological pathway to what could be causing somebody to be transgender or non-binary for that point. And we haven't talked about non-binary yet, which is a whole different subset, but it's all underneath the same umbrella. We need to first, to answer that question, understand that there is no such thing as the gender binary. Man and woman, male and female. That's just, it's not biblically true, it's not scientifically true, it's never been true, both from a sex standpoint, that is reproductive organs, and from a gender standpoint. What we have always known through humanity and cultures of the world dating back before we were even taking notes on this stuff would understand that there are more than two genders, right? We understand that it's a continuum, much like the light spectrum. So, when we look at the light spectrum, ultraviolet to infrared, and all the colors in between, the human eye can only pick up that small little, piece of the color wheel inside of that. That's all that we can perceive with our eyes. And being transgender, or being human for that matter, there are different elements of male and female in all of us. And it's expressed in many different ways, and we see it all the time, day after day, year after year, minute after minute, and people still deny it. No, there's only two, male and female, period. There is no in between. Well, that's just not true, because you wouldn't be able to explain a whole lot of different people. And we're talking about a huge population of people. We're talking about hundreds of millions of people at this point. The actual differences along that spectrum are wide and vast. So to answer your question, describing a possible cause of being transgender is not part of the diagnosis, right? Mm-hmm. Part of the diagnosis, which is very complicated, because you have to see a psychologist number one to just make sure that you're mentally sound, basically. Two, you need to see general practitioners and endocrinologists and all sorts of people that check you out. So these children, for example, that are saying, hey, I'm trans. I was 4 years old, by the way, when I knew. I didn't know the word existed. I didn't know what that word was. In fact, I'll go as far as to say, I didn't even know the difference between my sister's body and my body. I just knew that I was like my sister, but I wasn't being treated like her. I didn't know the difference in reproductive organs or any of that when I was real little. And it didn't matter. All I know is that I was not being treated the same way as her, and I found it to be very unfair. And it's because my brain was telling me one thing, and my parents and my friends and everyone else were telling me something else. And that's where that whole thing of, it must be a mental disorder came up. And you'll notice that for years and years, for decades in the DSM, they labeled it as something called gender identity disorder, and then gender dysphoria. And they labeled those as mental health concerns. But what people didn't realize is it's not a mental illness. It basically was saying, well, that's in the same category as someone that's got depression or anxiety. There's 67 million Americans that have those two things. So when people, try to, insult people like us and say we're mentally ill, they're absolutely incorrect. And they're actually doing a disservice to people that actually have real mental illness. Because people that actually do have mental illness can't control that. And it's nothing to make fun of. And yet they do. They use that as a tool to try to somehow make a pointless point about something they don't understand. So to answer the question completely, it doesn't matter what caused it. Just like we don't know what causes leukemia in little children still, and why the little boy next to that little girl died, but the little girl survived after chemotherapy. Doctors still scratch their heads on that one, just like they're scratching their heads on, why are people gay? Why are people straight? Why are people trans? Why are people non-binary? Why are people cisgender like yourself? The jury's out on a lot of this stuff, but we see it every day. It's evidenced. every day. And we see, that's why I brought up the whole, there's all these different things that happen before birth, and yet we don't argue about any of that. We say, yeah, that exists. Yeah, there's all sorts of things that happen that make us all different in one way or the other. Notice I'm not saying cause problems, because depending on who you are, it's not a problem. For me, it was a huge problem. And for most transgender people, it's a huge problem. Being incongruent is hell on earth. Um, so it doesn't really matter what the diagnosis is, as far as, oh, is it these genes or that genes that are responsible for it? And if you don't have that, that means you're not trans. And if you do have it, that means you are trans. That's not true, because that's just a part of the story. Or it's just, maybe it's part of the illness. Like, for example, we say smoking causes lung cancer. Well, I know a lot of people that died of lung cancer that never smoked a cigarette in their life. See what I mean? There's a lot of different, there's a lot of causation that's not being listed with that. So you really can't put it into that context. Because if you're trans, the only person that knows they're trans is that individual. There's very, very, very few people that go through what everybody calls a phase. Oh, you're just going through a phase. No, there's very few people that actually go through that. Nobody, I assure you, nobody would want to wake up one day and say, I'm female, I'm going to transition, I'm going to go through all of this societal hell and risk being killed and be rated by people and dehumanized by people and have exorcisms, given to me by the Christian right. And I'm allowed to say that because I was a Christian and I did have exorcisms performed on me, because obviously I'm possessed by a demon, right? So it's the silliness of our own human nature of not wanting to understand something that's different. And, the validity is this. I tell people this all the time, and they finally have an epiphany. They say the following: they're 4 years old. There's no way a 4-year-old knows who they are. They don't know this stuff at 4 years old. For Christ's sake, just let them be children. Let the kids be kids. And this is what I say. I was a kid. All the people that I know that are trans were children as well. We went through a different type of childhood than you did. But we went out and we played. And we rode bikes. And we did this and we did that. We were kids. But we were just very, very consciously aware that we were incongruent. Whereas when you're born congruent, it's subconscious. So Marcus, you knew that you were a boy, and I'm making an assumption right now, but let's just say you knew you were a boy.
It's a safe assumption, I think.
You knew you were a boy from the age of articulation, which typically runs between the ages of 3 and 8 years old. You absolutely knew you were a boy, but it never reached your conscious mind because everything was perfect. When you got a crew cut, that's fine. That's what boys do. Go play baseball with the boys. Go roll in the mud with the boys. Do this, do that. All of those societal things alongside of that all sort of made sense. You were, people said you look like a boy. They talked to you like a boy. You were a boy. You didn't have a problem. But when you're not, that's when it leaves the subconscious and goes into the conscious brain, and it's very painful because it's every single day. So that's the disconnect. Everybody knows who they are, whether you're trans or not. It's just some of us know consciously, whereas others of us take it for granted because it's subconscious for folks like yourself. Did I explain that sort of good?
Yes, absolutely. And I want to jump back a little bit because I think the danger that a lot of people run, the risk a lot of people run when they say things like, let the kids be kids, they shouldn't have to worry about this, they shouldn't have to think about that. Not only like they are thinking about this and have to, if this is something that they're dealing with in their life, like there's no way around that. But also when you say, let the kids be kids, don't let them think about this kind of thing, like 99% of the time, I feel like that person is either like sexualizing the topic or they're politicizing it. And it doesn't have to be either. So I wanted to ask you, more about kind of like the diagnosis process that you said you went through, just because I think that's something that not a lot of people, including myself, are or were aware of, or at least very ignorant about. Because people who say things like, like, let the kids be kids, they shouldn't have to think about like gender topics. Well, they might not understand. They might think that like, an 8-year-old woke up one day and his like progressive parents put him in a dress just for political reasons. And so I wanted to talk with you more about kind of that childhood experience, and then more of like the psychological stuff that you had to go through and what that was like for you.
Good. So let's start tearing at the fabric of misinformation, and let's start tearing at the fabric of mythology. First of all, parents don't teach children to be transgender. You can't be taught to be trans, just like you can't be taught to be straight, and you can't be taught to be cisgender. Cisgender meaning on the same side of, which means, someone like yourself who you're a man and you're good with it, right? So that's what cisgender means. So we'll use the word cisgender versus transgender. Your gender, your sex, your humanity is not an ideology. An ideology is something that can be learned. It's a belief system. It's an exercise of something that you could be taught and you can learn. You can't learn to be trans. That's not how this works. Mommy doesn't say, "Oh, I really want my boy to be a girl. I'm going to put a dress in her." Those folks watch too many movies, and those are horrible movies if you're watching those types of movies. That's just not how any of this works. Usually this is how 99.9% of the time it works out. A little kid, 4 years old, I've seen it as young as 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They describe something that is very painful to them, just like I did when I was 4. And I'll get into what I did in a second. And the parents usually don't have a flipping idea what they're even talking about. They don't understand. They don't know how to handle this. They know they love their child. They want to embrace their child, and they see the pain their child is going through. So what they'll typically do is, if it goes on for any amount of time, is they will then take the child to a doctor. The American Medical Association, the American Psychological Association, the American Psychiatric Association, the College Board of Physicians, and the College Board of nurses, of surgeons, of endocrinology, of all, just about every, not just about, I mean to say, every single medical organization in the United States and beyond already knows how this works. They already know the medical diagnoses, and there's been standards of care put into place long before you and I were born. But people don't realize that. There's something called WPATH. And before that, it was the Harry Benjamin Standards of Care. And these things have been in place longer than you and I have been alive. And they've been upgraded. They've been, as we learn more and more, just like in any scientific thing, like even with cancer and other diseases, as we learn more, we add to what we do to diagnose and to treat those types of things. So for transgender people, it's no different. The American Medical Association already has, embraced and actually put forward these things. And there's something called WPATH, which actually outlines, all right, here's the criteria that we have found that helps, so that people looking to transition, because not all trans people transition. That's something that people should pay attention to, is that not all of us actually transition. One reason might be because, economically, you're unable to. You can't afford to. Another reason might be you might have a health concern, and it's not safe for you to transition. Another, there's a myriad of reasons why some people don't transition, why others people only transition so far and stop, and then why others, like myself, transition completely, right? And they're all valid. It doesn't make you any less of a man or a woman. And so far in our society, we just, and it's sad because they label the transgender people as the perverts, and we have nothing to do with being perverted. All we want is affirmation for what we are. In fact, the last thing on our minds is sex. and genitals. That's the last thing we want to think about. And people don't understand that. It's the cisgender community, the people that are not trans, that are actually kind of, I hate saying this, but rather perverted. And they turn this whole dynamic into something rather sick and disgusting that never had existed before. They've created this problem where there was none. And it's kind of sad to watch humanity do this to one another by making assumptions and turning a subject, a very benign one at that, into something kind of gross and disgusting. And a lot of us, just about all of us take great offense to that because we're just human beings. And when you look at the standards of care that you have to go through with these medical doctors and a psychologist, the kid can't just go into a doctor and say, hey, I want to get on, estrogen and get rid of the testosterone in my body and blah, 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 or I want to be on puberty blockers. That doesn't happen. And then there's other people that say, well, they get sex changes and this and that. Nobody has surgery when you're a child. Number one, it doesn't make sense because you haven't fully developed yet. And having surgery too young could produce a result that is way less than desired for the effect that you're going for. So that's why we wait till you're an adult anyway. So you have enough tissue and donor tissue and everything else that has to happen in for the hormones to actually do what they're supposed to do naturally. So this whole myth circulating the internet about how, puberty blockers are dangerous. Number one, they're not dangerous. All drugs have side effects, but the side effects for puberty blockers, any doctor will tell you, we've been using them for 40 years because there's other issues that people go through that are not trans, that they needed these drugs in order to treat these people that were going through puberty maybe far too young. Children at 8 years old going through puberty, they needed to delay that because it would have caused other problems because of the maturity of their body. So there's all sorts of mechanisms in place, safeguards in place to make sure that when we're talking to these individuals that we're careful to understand who they are, because only they know who they are. But it's very easy to start discerning who might have a secondary problem and who might actually be talking about, hey, this is the real deal. The vast majority of people that do that have the real deal. And the other argument out there that circulates that shouldn't even be an argument because it's such a nonsensical thing is, well, you've obviously been abused as a child, or you have some sort of sexual abuse in your past. That is the largest piece of that is the largest piece of mythology since Zeus or Medusa. I mean, it's reprehensible for someone to say something like that. That is just not the case. They watch movies, and Hollywood is partly to blame. I got to be honest. Since the early 1900s, when silent films came out, they've always been mocking people like the man in the dress and the stereotypes that they create, and all through cartoons and going up through the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, all the way to 2013, when we had 50 First Dates, they still had this ridiculousness about what it is to be trans. And Hollywood created a stereotype, and I can tell you, because I'm an advocate for transgender people, stereotypes kill. And there are a lot of people that are trans that are being murdered just because of the way they were born. And it's scary, and it doesn't make any sense because, it doesn't affect anyone else. And so talking about children and how they're diagnosed, I can tell you what happened with me. When I was 4 years old, I was raised Catholic, and we were saying prayers at the edge of my bed with my mom, and we had just finished the Lord's Prayer, and she said, okay, honey, now go ahead and you say a prayer to God. So I went ahead and thought about it, and I'm like, I don't even know what to say, and she sort of guided me along, like, say, God bless Daddy and Mommy and your sister and your friends and your relatives. And I said all that. She says, now just talk to God. Just, ask God anything you want. So I laid my head on the bed with my hands over it. And I said, God, please fix me by the morning. And I started to cry. And my mom goes, oh, honey, what's wrong? And she put her hand to my head like I might have had a fever. And I said, nothing. And she goes, of course something's wrong. Tell me what's wrong. And now mom, years later, had to tell me this whole conversation, because when you're 4, you don't remember the entirety of the conversation. I do remember the event, but I didn't remember the word for word. Only mom could do that for me. And what she had told me is, she said, the next words out of your mouth were profound. You didn't know how to articulate what you were trying to say. So you said, Mom, am I a boy and a girl? Because you knew you were being treated as a boy and your brain was telling you that you were a girl. So, my mom says to that, and this is the 1970s, where we didn't really have the language for this, even though we existed forever. There was just no language in mainstream, society. She says, oh, honey, no, you're just my handsome little boy. And I can't put to words how crushed I was, because I was expecting the following answer instead. No, honey, you're just a girl, but something happened and we have to do things a little different with you for a little while. But everything will be okay, I promise. I would have felt so much better if that were the case, but that's not the case. So mom's saying everything's going to be all right. You're just going through a phase, and sometimes being a child can be very difficult. And as a little child, you trust 2 people in your life, your mom and your dad. So when mom says you're going to be okay, you bet your butt you're going to be okay. So she gives me a kiss on my forehead, and I felt at ease because mom just said, I'm going to be okay. That lots of people go through this, apparently. And she was a nurse, but she didn't understand what I was going through at the time. So I went to bed, and over the next weeks, months, and even years, she noticed that this little phase that I was going through never went away. And, part of that is in my book that people can read about. And the interesting thing was that mom never understood what this was, but she never treated me poorly. A lot of people that are trans lose their family, lose everybody, because they have some, I don't know, just some mental block on this, and they can't accept it. They think that it's some sort of ideology or something, like the Church of Trans. There's no such thing. It's, we're just people. And I can tell people right now that I would never ever want to be born this way. I would never ever want to be trans, ever. And I wouldn't wish it upon my worst enemy. It's hell on earth. I would never want this for myself or for anybody else. It's terrible. Not because you're incongruent, but because we live in a really, really crazy society where people, they can't mind their own business. They think they know everything about everyone else. Look what we did to the poor lepers, right? For 2,000 years, we chastised people with leprosy, saying it's the hand of God punishing you for sinning against God. Well, I didn't sin against God. Well, then it's because you're paying for the sins of your parents. And that's written in scripture, by the way. 2,000 years we did that to people with leprosy, and kicked them out of society, even murdered them because they were different, and they had, and it wasn't until 1873 that a Norwegian scientist found out that it was a myobacterial infection. And then it would still take 65 more years for society and religion to concede that they had it wrong all along, that they were wrong for 2,000 years. And they treated these people horribly and murdered them horribly. And it's just, this is what's happened. And I can name time after time after time society has done this. And it's so sad, because at the end of the day, these little kids that are asking for puberty blockers, and trust me, if I was a kid again and I had access to puberty blockers back then, I would have done it in a heartbeat. Not even a heartbeat. It wouldn't have even taken that long. And all a puberty blocker does is it delays the onset of puberty. And for someone assigned male at birth, puberty is very toxic, because testosterone is one of the most toxic chemicals in the body. It drastically changes things for people. And so delaying that, sort of allows the medical organizations to solidify, if you will, solidify the diagnoses and figure out the right plan of attack for when, if the person does truly want to transition, when do we intervene with HRT, which is hormone replacement therapy, and allow that person to go through the correct puberty instead of the incorrect one. And there are literally thousands and thousands of young people that have gone through this puberty blocker stuff and transitioned that are unbelievably like exponentially more happy and more. I don't even want to use the word happy because it's not about being happy. It's about being congruent. They feel like their life has some normalcy to it at that point. And believe it or not, a lot of people don't understand this. You develop just like any other natal female. If you're at that young age introduced into the correct puberty, we all know girls start puberty younger than boys. And if you allow that person to go through the correct puberty, everything lines up perfectly. The body fat lines up perfectly. The bone structure doesn't change like it would have. The voice doesn't change like it would have. The facial and body hair doesn't form like it would have. Everything sort of aligns itself, and I can give plenty of examples of human beings that some of them are pop stars that people see on TV, and they're just not the wiser that this person, went through puberty blockers, and now their net worth is worth $25 million because they're a pop star. This is what we need to embrace as a society, is that, what they're doing in certain states right now is they're actually taking the only lifeline away from these people. We belong to the most marginalized demographic on planet Earth. We have the highest suicide ideation and suicide rate on the planet. And here's the other myth we're going to bust right now. It's not because we hate ourselves, and it's not because we're confused. We are not confused. I have never been confused. We are not confused people. I think y'all are confused, not you. But the people looking in from the outside are the ones that are confused. It is not us that are confused. We know exactly who we are. And and the problem is that, there's a million reasons that people give why they should put their 2 cents into something they don't understand. And it's kind of tragic. I hope I answered that thoroughly for you.
Absolutely. And so there was a question I wanted to ask a while back. And because you mentioned your Catholic upbringing and we brought up biblical history again, I do want to go ahead and bring the question back up to kind of dissolve some more confusion and bust another myth. I wanted to ask you about what you said earlier about how the gender dichotomy of male and female is not supported, not just scientifically, but scripturally in like the Christian Bible and the Christian tradition. And I kind of wanted to kind of get your thoughts on that and what you meant by that, because I think that's something that, some listeners and definitely a lot of people that I've encountered in real life or in the internet may not have thought about at all before.
Yeah, that's true. We typically let's first look at Catholics, right? So there's different Bibles. I studied theology for 32 years, and I've read the translated Quran from Islam. I've read the translated Torah. I've read the Old Testament, obviously. I've read all the different New Testaments, and there's quite a few of them, and in the various interpretations of them from different centuries, because there's different interpretations given through the different centuries. Most of them come from a Greek translation, and as we all know, that back in biblical times, it was Aramaic that was written. So it was a translation of a translation, and a lot of words get mixed up and conflated and confused and replaced. And then half the Bible was written basically as a new body of work, because the Codex Sinaiticus, which is one of the oldest versions of the original texts, is missing approximately 600 pages. Well, how do you fill up the rest of that? And then what you have to do is you have to say, okay, all right, fine and dandy, you got the Old Testament after all the Jewish texts. So here's the Old Testament. All right, no problem. Then we have the New Testament. Well, where did that come from? Well, in 325 AD, and here's the astounding part, Marcus. Most people that I talk to that are Christian, and I can say this, I'm allowed to say this because I've been Christian my whole life. Most Christians don't even know the stuff I'm about to say. They don't even realize it. And it's sad because they really should. The New Testament is something that happened in 325 AD. Constantine was in power, and he called together the First Council of Nicaea, which was comprised of 200 of the most scholarly theologians of the time, to decide which passages, which writings, which authors would make it into the final cut of God's instruction manual to all of humanity. I want you to think about what I just said, because every Christian will say the Bible, the Holy Bible, is God's instruction manual for all of humanity. There's not even an argument about that. They, across the board, that's what they call it. Yet, the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD had a bunch of men decide which of God's writings are going to make it into the final version of what they called the Bible back then, and which ones would not. That's why you ended up with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But you didn't end up with the Book of Thomas, the Book of Mary. There's a whole bunch of books that you didn't end up with because they didn't decide to put those in. And for years and years, they came up with excuse after excuse why that happened. And the reality is when you talk to an actual theologian or a bishop or someone in the higher clergy of the church, which I have done, they are kind of they do come forward and talk about that quite a bit. And they have a much different narrative than the parishioners do about, what all of this means. And the reality is that, let's start it with something simple. Who are the first two people on planet Earth from the book of Genesis?
Adam and Eve.
Right. So, Adam and Eve. So, we all know that Eve wasn't the first woman on the planet because, of course, the Jewish texts, which were predating the Old Testament, which is where that all came from, because you have Genesis 1, Genesis 2, all that stuff, was actually Lilith. Now, Lilith was the first wife of Adam, but she didn't work out so well. She was a bit promiscuous. So she was dropped from the original text of the Old Testament and replaced with Eve. And how was Eve created, Marcus?
From the rib of Adam.
From the rib of Adam. So her DNA, basically is Adam's DNA. Wouldn't you say? I mean, if she was created out of Adam, she's a clone of Adam, basically. She's created from the rib or the body part of Adam. So you know where I'm going with this, don't you? If you really want to get technical about the Bible and when we think about all these things, like in movies, we say, oops, look at that continuity issue. We'll see that like a character in the movie was wearing a blue suit, but in the very next scene, during the same car chase, he's wearing a black suit. They messed up. So continuity issue in the Bible, comes to, well, Eve was made out of Adam's rib and then turned into the female form. So there's your first transgender person on the planet if you want to get really technical about it. People that listen to this will go, oh, absurd. That's heresy. That's absurd. But it's really a continuity within the Bible that I've talked to a lot of theologians and pastors and higher ups in the Catholic Church even, that said that's a very good point. That's actually very astute for you to deal with that. But they don't believe in this stuff yet. The church is slowly coming around to gay people. It's going to take another 100 years before they come around to trans people, and then non-binary will be the next one after that, and then we'll be right back where we were in the 17th century, which is outside of the gender binary, because the gender binary was born in the 1800s by Western civilization. Most people don't even know that.
Can you elaborate on that more?
So Western civilization, the colonialists in the Americas, whatnot, at some point in time, they decided that it was just much easier to move through history knowing that there was this or that, you know, zeros and ones, black and white, on or off, male and female. But we've always known from different cultures of the world, and I can name a few: the Kahui of the Asian continent of Asia, the Shaman from Eastern Europe, the the um, the two spirit of the indigenous people in North and Central America. And that's just a few. Those types of people have always existed, and they were highly revered in their communities, and they would be the old versions of what transgender would be or non-binary would be back in the day. And you know, back then, the way they looked at it was, well, there's five genders. Let's look at it that way. And that was just too complicated for Western society. And I'm not trying to purposely put us down, because I'm part of that construct. But it was inaccurate, and we changed that narrative because for centuries and even thousands of years, we knew that there were these people like the shaman, for example. Everybody's heard of the shaman, but they may not know what that is. Somebody that embodies the male and the female. And they were highly revered, and they were also thought of as healers. The two spirit with the American Indian and other indigenous people from Central and North America were also revered highly, and they didn't fit the male or female construct either. And it went on deeper and deeper and deeper as you dive deeper into what is really the causation here. And what I like to tell people is that there's the truth, and then you can easily replace the truth with a myth simply by repeating it over and over again until you get a herd of people repeating the same thing over and over. And over time, that new truth, which was a fabrication, becomes the new truth. The old truth disappears. And that's really what's happening and what has happened. We're sort of relearning something that we already knew a long time ago, but we're treating it as it's brand new, and it's not brand new. So that's really what I meant by that.
Kind of pulling things back to your life a little bit more. To go back to, we were looking at childhood before and kind of relating your experience as a trans child to those of others and what you went through. I wanted to ask you, and this might seem kind of like a dumb question, but I don't want to come off that way. As in adulthood, in the context of your like multi-varied career in life, what was transitioning like for you? And then within that, the kind of dumb question that I want to ask is, what is behind the transitioning process? Like, what makes you want to do that? Is it like the pursuit of like an inner peace, or is it kind of like so that you can be recognized for what you know that you are, or what is kind of the psychology behind that?
Everything you said can be boiled down into a single word, a singularity, if you will: affirmation. So affirmation can be a sense of well-being from within. It could also be that sense of well-being from within comes from affirmation, and affirmation comes from, we all have to deal with other people in society. And when you've not been born correctly to begin with, and people don't understand that, because let's be honest, 99.3% of the human population never has to think about this stuff. So they don't understand. Sort of like when you see someone that's born with autism. I have so many friends that have had children with autism. I'm so blessed to have been in their lives and got to meet these fascinating individuals. And a lot of people don't understand that. How is it that person doesn't understand emotion? Everybody has emotion, but not everybody has emotion, and not everybody perceives emotion the way we do. And that's why autism we now understand to be a spectrum, rather than you're autistic or you're not, sort of on and off, male, female. Autism is actually on a spectrum as well. And in fact, that it's actually been renamed to the spectrum, a set of spectrum disorders. And they don't even want to use disorders at this point, because there's so much positive stuff that can come out of that as well. So when I talk to people about does somebody transition, it's to get a sense of what everyone else takes for granted, congruity. It's hard to be a human being. You sort of feel subhuman when you're not congruent because you really don't feel like you can belong. You want to belong. And for me, even though I said the gender binary doesn't really exist, I'm rather a gender binary person. I am a woman. I am female. So I embody male, female, right? But there's a lot of people out there that are gender fluid or gender non-gender conforming, non-binary, that they embody both or neither, in fact. And but we'll just talk about me so we don't complicate things right now. But for me, I ended up, I always knew who I was, and it was always a tragedy. And puberty was a tragedy when I saw my girlfriends going through it, and I wasn't able to do that because up until 11 years old, remember, I didn't have the internet back then. It didn't exist. At 11 years old, I didn't know much about the body. I still thought I could have babies when I was grown up, that someday I would get married and I would have kids, because the girls all would sit down and we'd all talk, and I used to hang out with them quite a bit, and we talk about, how many kids are you going to have when you're an adult, and this and that. And everyone would do that, and including me. And eventually the whole idea that you're a boy, you're not going to have kids, sort of went away, and they just sort of, they kept talking to me because I kind of fit in. Whereas a lot of the boys, I never understood the boys so much. Especially when I was a teenager, they wanted to talk about engines and 12 gauge shotguns and army hunting knives and just stuff that I had no interest in. And they were talking about girls in really weird ways that I didn't want to talk about girls in that way because that's not how I saw the world. So transitioning for me was difficult because I grew up in a very small town, and I ended up conforming and assimilating. A lot of people my age ended up assimilating into what society thought we should be rather than who we really were. So, in other words, in all intensity, I was actually an actress. I was acting, I was playing the part of what everybody thought I should be rather than who I really was. And it was tragic because that's where the mental illness part comes in, because you're trying to do something that is completely unnatural to you. Me trying to come across as a boy and then a man and then try to be successful in that endeavor was tragically terrible for me. It didn't work out very well, and I'm not going to give away my book, but there's a lot of really rough stuff that I went through that proves that point. Now, that being said, not transitioning also gave me access to quite a bit of other things because I developed what I call occupational ADD. And what that means is that I kept myself so busy that I didn't have time to be, thrust into, oh my God, I can't do this another day. This is so hard. Why do I have to live my life like this? Every other girl gets to live their life exactly perfectly, the way they are, and they don't have this primal issue to deal with. Why do I have to deal with this? So keeping myself busy kept those thoughts at bay. So I ended up at a very young age, very lucky, to be introduced to the music business by the vice president of the, excuse me, by the Anne Ruckert, who happened to be working with people like Barbra Streisand, Michael Jackson, Quincy Jones, Sting, Madonna, all those people. And she was also the vice president. She sat on the board as the vice president of the Grammy Awards. And I happened to get pulled into the music business just by pure happenstance of being in the right place at the right time by her. She was just a wonderful person. And from there, I went on to be a songwriter, a producer, someone that would help people get over stage fright. I was an artist mentor. I was a voiceover artist. A lot of concert spots. You know what I'm talking about. Like when Def Leppard or some group is coming to a stadium near you, you'd hear that announcer sort of do the coming this Saturday to the arena, blah blah blah. Sometimes that was me, and that was dysphoric. I mean, that was really difficult to do because here I was playing this part, and when I was done, and it did pay well, but when I was done, I was emotionally exhausted. I would go home crying because I hated that. That here I am, there's the voice that everybody loves and wants more of, and it's not me. You know, that was me going through puberty the wrong way that caused that. But that's not who I am. But it paid the bills. You know what I mean?
Right.
So I went through the music industry on and off, doing some pretty incredible projects, including one that helped. It was a philanthropic project that I did that I helped produce that was for to bring advocacy to the children of Africa that were basically walking 10 miles each day to get a bucket of water to bring back to their town, and it was muddy water at that, to try to make it somewhat potable so they can, drink and cook with. And so we did this whole exhibit, and I was responsible for helping to organize and arrange the music and develop the music for it. And that exhibit still exists today in the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. I'm very proud of that. Not because my name is on it, but because I feel like we did something good, and I didn't have to get paid to do it. That's what made me feel really good, is that I did it, to try to help somebody else. And if anything in my life that I've learned is empathy. I have empathy for so many different types of people because of who I am and because of the hardships that I endured. The hardships were both societal and the incongruity I was born with. And, here I was in the music business, but at 5 years old, I was deaf. I couldn't hear at 5 years old. I didn't get my hearing back until 6. I had to go to the Children's Hospital in New York City and have a surgery done on me so that I could begin hearing again. And I ended up with perfect pitch. Go figure that one out. But then by the age of 25, I'm in the music business doing stuff, and I was diagnosed with a very rare blood cancer. And I looked it up, and it said there was a 5-year life cycle for people that were diagnosed with this, and I was giving phlebotomies, and I was on special medicine, and I was going through all this. It was absolutely dreadful. I don't wish that upon anybody either. It's really horrible. And then as I got a little older, I suffered a stroke. Very young. I suffered a stroke and lost the left-hand side of my body temporarily. I was able to regain it, but that was caused by a congenital heart defect. I was also born with 2 holes in my heart that the doctors never found at birth. And after the stroke, they had to perform 3 heart operations on me to repair the heart and to make it so that blood clots could no longer go, through my carotid arteries up into my brain. So they blocked off my left atrial appendage with a device as well. So all of those things I went through, I try to tell people, I went and survived cancer. I went and survived a stroke. I went and survived 3 heart operations and being deaf at 5 years old. Every one of those things pale, absolutely pale in comparison to being born transgender. And I hope that puts context. I don't want to make light of it, but the reality is I'm one of those few individuals that can say, quite honestly, being born transgender for me was actually more difficult than going through those things where I actually stared death in the face a few times over. Being born transgender is exponentially worse because the most primal part of your humanity is missing. You don't seem to belong because your brain is physically wired one way and your body was wired another. Now that I've transitioned, which basically is this: when one transitions, and let's take mine as an example. I was assigned male at birth. What I had to do is start taking a testosterone blocker. And basically the way to do that is it's basically a blood pressure medicine that you take that has a really happy side effect of an androgen blocker. So I took this medication that would suppress the testosterone in my body. And I would also take estrogen, which would up my estrogen to normal female values. I was a little older when I transitioned, so, but I still was able to go through what 99.3% of humanity never goes through, and that is a second puberty. I actually went through two puberties. So the second puberty was because of the hormones. One, we get rid of the testosterone. Two, we introduce estrogen. Now, as we all know, males and females have both testosterone and estrogen. They're just in different variations or different degrees of magnitude. So both male and female have both of those sex hormones. So what they did is they lowered it, and it starts to cause an androgynous sort of reaction. And then when the estrogen is implemented, the secondary sexual characteristics of the individual start to blossom, if you know what I mean. And your body fat redistributes, your muscle mass. Here's another one that people don't understand. You know, we talk about sports a lot these days, inaccurately, by the way. Your muscle mass melts away. Like, you don't have muscle mass after 2 years of being on HRT. It's literally, it literally melts off you, if you will. And so with that, there's also psychological things that happen, because of course, you know, when you really understand that you're becoming more congruent with your own self, you really do a lot of introspection. The emotions are far more intense, and a lot of other things start to change as well within there. The one thing that does not change, however, is body hair, facial hair, and your voice. And obviously, if you've had a lot of skeletal, you know, changes because of the testosterone, like a very pronounced jawline or any other skeletal issues, they stay. However, when you're on estrogen long enough, you actually can develop osteoporosis because your bone density does start to change. And there's another myth that we just busted, because a lot of people say, well, your skeleton is your skeleton is your skeleton. And that's just, you know, hormones have an incredible effect on the entire body. And if they're not administered correctly, you know, in the first place by the way you were born, you know, we have ways in which we can deal with that. And that helped me incredibly. And after a while of being on that, I went through electrolysis and laser hair reduction, which was so painful that I could take the strongest guy that you know, and I could sit him down in front of my electrologist and say, all right, we're just gonna put you with her for 5 minutes, not 2 hours. I go 2 hours twice a week, and I do that for about a year straight. And it's 2 hours, so 4 hours a week for a whole year, you know, each week for a full year. We're going to sit you in there for less than 5 minutes with her. And I promise you, Marcus, every one of those guys that has something to say about us would scream crying, leaving that office within 5 minutes. They wouldn't be able to take the pain. It's so painful, I can't even describe it to you. Like, there's women that get electrolysis done all the time. But they didn't go through the wrong puberty. And when you go through the wrong puberty, you have very thick, coarse hair that grows. Whereas if you go through the puberty the correct way as a female, you don't have that coarse hair. And getting rid of a hair here and there and everywhere is a whole lot simpler to deal with. But when you have a lot of hair, and I do mean a lot of hair, not only do they have to zap it, but they have to zap it over and over and over and over again throughout the year, because it'll grow back a little less dense the next time. But then it'll grow back again and again and again and again, and they keep doing these clearings. And they basically are zapping thousands of hair follicles on you, you know, throughout that process. For me, my secondary characteristics grew very well. I developed, if that's what you want to talk about, my development was like any other natal female as far as what puberty does to an individual, right? So that part of me upstairs worked out rather fine. But what I had to do, because my chest was a little wider because of my skeletal, differences, I ended up with a little bit of extra help up there. Not any bigger, but just a little extra help to round things out a little better. And then I went through what's called GRS. And not everybody gets GRS, and it's not a necessary step. But GRS is gender. Excuse me, I don't know. I have something in my throat. So what we do is we affirm everything by getting. I'm just going to say the right word rather than GCS. Gender confirmation surgery is also called vaginoplasty for folks like myself. So we go through that step as well. And so anatomically speaking, everything lines up properly for me at this point. Can I have children? No. I can't bear children, and I'm too old now anyway. But I just thank God that I'm able to finally experience my life more congruent than it was. Am I ever going to be fully congruent? Of course not. I was born differently. There's no way around that. I was born differently. I can't experience everything that a natal female experiences. And I can't experience the joys and wonders of all the different rites of passage that every other female had to go through, or basically enjoyed going through, or in some cases hated going through. I never got to enjoy those things or hate those things. And that's very tough to do. Sort of like a girl that at 16 finds out that she has a malformed uterus and has to get a hysterectomy and then has to live the rest of her life infertile. I have those same feelings that person has, and that's what people need to understand, is that there's really no difference in the sadness or the sense of loss that comes. And believe me, there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. I know I was born differently, but I'm still a woman. I just was born a little differently, and thank God for science that I've been able to feel more congruent in my life because of it.
So, with all the things that you've gone through as part of your quest for, personal affirmation, for congruence, for internal and external affirmation, your book is titled "Hiding from Myself." And so, do you feel, being on the other end of this process of trying to juggle all of the things that you've been trying to and been able to accomplish with this personal journey, coming out on the other side of that, after publishing your book, after doing the things that you're doing today, do you feel like you're no longer hiding from yourself? And if so, what is that like? Like what is that freedom like?
That is such an incredibly great question. Thanks for asking that. Truly, that's a great question. Hiding from myself came about because during my entire childhood and my younger years as an adult, I literally was hiding from myself, because not only was I born trans, but I was also born liking guys, not girls. So I wasn't gay, right? There's a big difference. Guys that like other guys are gay. Girls that like guys are heterosexual. I was always a girl. My external genitalia might have said otherwise, but I was always a girl. And people that I had relationships with all knew that. They still had relationships with me anyway, these women. They had relationships with me anyway. And they knew exactly who I was. And the thing is that I wasn't attracted to them in that way, but I was forcing myself. I was like, all right, if I'm going to survive this, then I have to do this. Because I was getting beat up when I was younger. I was getting, it was tragic what I was going through. And when you go through that and you see things on the news, and we didn't have internet back then, but boy, when that hit the news and you heard about something about somebody that I actually identified with, like watching the Phil Donahue show, I saw this person from the UK. Her name was Carolyn Cossey. In 1980, she was in a James Bond film called For Your Eyes Only. She's a beautiful, beautiful centerfold from Playboy. Actually, that was 1981. And she's just a gorgeous model. And I said, when I grow up, I want to be just like her. And as the show went on, he said, Carolyn was actually born as Barry. Carolyn is a transsexual. They didn't have the word transgender back then in 1980, but she's a transsexual. So 100% of the people in the world that saw that James Bond movie had no idea that the Bond girl was somebody that was transgender, somebody that went through transition as a child, believe it or not. So this person was able to, skip half of their puberty. They didn't quite get there in time to stop it all, but they were able to stop half the puberty and then proceed in the correct direction after that. And she went on to have an enormous career, and she later got married and has had a wonderful life. And I was just interviewed by the same person that interviewed her just a few weeks before, just a few weeks ago from the UK, and it was an honor to finally come full circle with that individual. And so there's an example of somebody that, like me, would have been hiding from themselves. I came from a very small town. People didn't understand people like me. I used to watch the boys pick on this other boy, and I won't say who he was, but he was gay, and they used to really, use really bad words and stuff against this person, push him to the ground, just terrible stuff. Like, why? To what end are you doing this? Are you proving that you're more of a man because you can push this person that's rather effeminate over? Does that make you feel good? It was just such a weird thing that I see still happening today, right? And I looked at all that and I said, there's just no way I can handle this. I can't. I just can't. My first true love was a boy, and I was 14 years old. And he was a boy. He lived down on the other side of town where I grew up, and he had a horse farm. And I went over to his house, and I didn't know that he would like me in that way or not, but he did, and I liked him in that way. And I described to him that I'm not gay, and he said, what? He didn't understand at the time, so I had to sit him down and explain, something happened, and I came out of mom incorrectly. I'm supposed to be, physically female. And he says, oh. And he kind of understood. It was the strangest thing for me. And there I was with this individual for 9 months, having a wonderful relationship, and it felt absolutely natural. The butterfly effect was in my stomach and stuff, and everything was wonderful. And then I got beat up, and then, beat up again. And it was just like, you know what? I'm not doing this anymore. And I'm going to force myself to like girls, and that's going to be that. And I'll just have to stay in this boy's body, because there's just no way, because there's not enough human beings on the planet that are going through what I'm going through. Because when you live in a small town, that's all that exists. You don't realize that there's this great big world out there, and literally millions of people that have the same affliction that you do. And me not knowing that until I grew up, I decided to hide from myself. That's where the name of the book came from. And it's a story about, assimilation and conformity to a societal standard, rather than allowing you to be authentic to yourself. Because here's the thing that they teach you, whether it's in church or if it's in some sort of meditation class, or even an atheist for that matter, we're all on a journey, and it's a journey for ourselves and only ourselves. Even Christians will tell you, when you're judged by God, you're judged all by yourself. You're judged alone. So it makes me wonder, why does somebody that's going to get judged alone by God care about my, the way I'm going to be judged? It's not like me and you are going to be averaged together when when St. Peter, opens up that gate, if
Right.
that gate even exists in the first place, right? We don't know. These are belief systems. I'm not an atheist. I believe that there's something else out there, but I don't believe that it's this limited, angry, but very loving, but angry God that we've done throughout all of history, the 15,000 years of polytheism, and then now that we have basically the infancy of the monotheistic era, we're struggling to even get out of our own ways with this stuff. And so I sort of became religiously agnostic, and people don't understand that either. It means I don't follow man-made religion, because every religion in the world thinks the the shoe in on meeting God and getting that backstage pass. And there's 4,200 religions, and then you talk to Christians, my fellow Christians, I should say. Even though I'm agnostic, I'm always going to be a Christian, I guess, right? There's 33,000. That's a real number, by the way, denominations of Christianity, because Christians can't even get along with each other and agree on what parts of the gospel they're going to adhere to and not adhere to, or what interpretation they're going to do it, because of course God wrote the instruction manual so that we would have to interpret it over and over again and confuse us, because that's really what he wants to do. None of that makes sense, right? What I think makes sense is that my mom, who's staring down at me every single day from not the heaven that's in the Bible, but from a much, much bigger place than heaven, staring down at me and looking over me in all eternity, that place that she is where I'm going to be someday too. And I'm going to be in that higher frequency, or, that collective, or that source area that some people call God. I'll be there too someday, and every one of us will be there. We can't avoid it. But I'm not going to sit here and mouth off a bunch of rules and then not follow the rules that I mouth off because I've only read a tenth of the Bible, and I fail to realize that there's 700 pages over here that says you're not allowed to do this, this, and this, and this, and this. And you know what? If your kid does this and this and this, you're allowed to stone them to death. Did you know that? And blah blah blah. There's all this stuff in there that's just it's to me, it's silly. If you want to have religion and it makes you feel better, it makes you feel closer to God, I think everybody should embrace that and go for it. But as soon as you start infringing on somebody else's life with that belief system, that's where we run into problem with humanity. And that's why there's been so many wars fought throughout all of the ages, and why Catholics look down upon Muslims, and Muslims look down upon Catholics, and all of them look down upon atheists, and every one of those people look down upon people that are LGBT. But there's one major difference between all of those subsets and people within the LGBT. People within the LGBT are not part of an ideology or a belief system. My humanity is not up for debate. I hear people say, well, I'm allowed to have my opinion because of the First Amendment. And I say to them, wrong. You're not allowed to have an opinion about my humanity. I don't have opinions about your humanity. My humanity isn't up for debate any more than yours is. Who you are is who you are. And I'm not going to chastise that. Who I am is who I am. And that's the part people need to start, just like wearing the mask during the pandemic. You need to trust in science at least a little bit, because the medical establishments all around the world already have this covered. They already know that this is a medical issue that we are responding to, and this stuff has been around for decades when it comes to the proper treatment and diagnosis of this. And people are now just learning about it, and that's the problem with humanity, is we're very slow to learn new things because we think they're new even though they're not new. It's made it into your little circle of trust in the world. Today years old. We say that, right? I learned that when I was today years old. So I'm trying to help people understand that we're just people. I'm just a person. And yes, my voice sounded a lot different when I was different. And yes, this is actually my voice. I'm not doing anything to put my voice here. Um, my voice was basically, if you ever heard the movie, did you ever hear the movie trailer guy?
Yes.
Yeah, that was my voice. It really was.
So
So
that's why you were doing the voice announcing and voice acting things.
yeah, the voice acting stuff, or announcing concerts and all that stuff, and going out and quite honestly, going out in front of anywhere between 4 and 25,000 people and talking to them without a care in the world. I was able to overcome a lot of different things that people call stage fright, and and quite honestly, transitioning after puberty causes stage fright. So I had a whole different type of stage fright to get over when I started transitioning, because I knew people were biased. I knew they were not knowledgeable. I don't want to just arbitrarily use the word ignorant, because that belongs to a subset of society that are willfully ignorant. They know that the medical establishments and they know the evidence of A, B, and C, and that, that you can't learn to be this way, but yet they stay willfully ignorant that, no, that's not how that works. It's this way. Even though they don't even understand what it is. That's what I call the ignorant part of our culture. Then you just have the people that just don't know what they don't know. And my job is to help. Just like other trans people that do what I do. Try to help people understand a little bit. Have a little patience with people. And try to explain. Listen, I've been compared to drag queens and to cross dressers. And I can sit here right now on your program and say, I have absolutely zero in common with any of those. I don't have anything in common with a cross dresser. I don't, for me, being a woman has nothing to do with my clothing, so that would be silly. And two, I'm not a drag queen, because most drag queens are gay men that do that for a living as entertainment. It's sort of a caricature that they play. I have nothing in common with any of that. I'm just a woman that was born a little bit differently. I'm trying to be congruent, and I'm trying to live my life the fullest it could possibly be lived with what I was given as the cards in my hand.
Amber, I think that if you consider your job, your mission to be dismantling misinformation, into teaching people, leading people into new knowledge and new wisdom patiently, I think you're doing a great job. And I know you don't seem like you need any affirmation from me, but I think who you are is great. And I think it's awesome. I think you're an inspiration to anyone who comes into contact with your work, whether they're coming from a background where they would consider themselves trans or not. I think that you have a lot to give to the world. You've done a lot. You've got a lot coming out. I wanted to kind of give you an opportunity to plug your book, and then also to talk about any upcoming projects, like your upcoming podcast or anything that you want to before we kind of close out here.
Thank you for the compliment. That was wonderful. Thank you. The book is Hiding from Myself. It's available wherever books are sold. Apparently, most people go to Amazon.com, but it's on Barnes and Noble and everywhere else. But it's on Amazon.com, and you can also go to my website, which is amberrosewashington.com, and learn a little bit more about me that way. And I have a couple new projects coming up. One is in the end of June. We are premiering a new show. It's a new podcast, and my publicist and a couple of producers from Hollywood are helping me with, and it's called The Journey Unscripted. And what the show is about, it's sort of a humorous take on life. So it's about the uncanny things that happen unscripted in our lives. For example, first date's gone bad, right? And the most incredible thing that's happened to you with for example, a celebrity, right? So there's all these stories that exist out there from these wonderful people that we've been interviewing. And we try to have short, instead of an hour of someone like myself talking to people, we have these little 10-15 minute segments of these different stories that are uber fascinating. And by the way, it's all done with a sense of humor. One of the people that did the first testimonial for my book was a man named Colin Mockery, that you might know from Whose Line Is It Anyway on TV. And So a lot of that is through method acting and impromptu and improvisational, comedy, if you will. So it should be a very fun show, and each show is going to be completely different than the last. And we're really hoping to get a nice audience with that when it begins. And right now, the publicist is saying the end of June we should be ready to start releasing these shows, and so I'm very excited about that. And the other thing I'm excited about are two little projects. One is I'm going to be releasing a book later this summer on how to get over stage fright. And years in the music business has taught me a lot of things about that. And I came up with a method that I used for people that were auditioning for American Idol. And it helped them on the show. And so I took that method and I sort of wrote it down methodically and found that, wow, this doesn't just work for vocalists and musicians and comedians and actors and actresses, but this actually is going to help somebody that has to give that speech at your sister's wedding, or somebody that's going to pitch a new product to the investment team at your company, or a sales pitch at your company. So it sort of has tentacles everywhere, because it sort of allows people to look at what is the causality behind your stage fright and what is the real quick thing that you can do to get over it and actually use it for yourself as an advantage rather than a disadvantage. And I show people how to do that. And I've had people in as short as 48 hours totally transition into this person that's able to, show so much self-confidence that you'd think they were doing it for years. It's quite amazing. And I'm very excited to have that happen, because with that one, I will be starting, a national tour that I was supposed to do this year, but obviously the pandemic sort of put that on the back burner. So my actual tour is going to include my first and my second book, all in one sort of thing. How to get over stage fright, and teaching literally thousands of people how to put the reins on that stage fright that they may have, and use it to their advantage.
Well, that makes sense, because the two for you, I mean, in your personal journey, were kind of intertwined. And so.
Yeah. Very true. Very true.
So thank you again so much for coming on. Keep doing the fantastic work that you're doing, Amber. I really appreciate you taking the time. Honestly, when you talk about publicists and producers and stuff, I get like a little bit like anxious. I feel like I'm like way underqualified to be talking to you. So I really do appreciate it.
Listen, here's something that I've done my whole life, and I want to explain this to you and your audience. Yes, I know a lot of very interesting people. Yes, I've walked around with Arnold Schwarzenegger, and I've worked in the same circles with Taylor Swift and a lot of interesting people. But at the end of the day, we're all people, and I'm not famous. I mean, I'm famous in my own mind. How's that? People say, but you're kind of a star, and I say to them, no, I'm a flashlight with 2C batteries in it. I'm just a flashlight, and you know what? At the end of the day, we're all just people, and we all have our talents, and this happens to be one of your talents that you have, and I fully embrace and appreciate what you're doing. And it doesn't mean that people like me are unapproachable, because you'd be surprised how many times I thought that very thing and then found myself in the middle of a conversation with Stevie Nicks or someone like that I thought I would never meet in my life. And it happens if you put yourself in the right place and you manifest that stuff in your life in the right place and time. And I find that to be a very fascinating part of life, because we're all on the same level, even keeled. You know what I mean? I'm not on a higher platform than you are. That's the way I look at the world.
Thank you. I feel like you like radiate inspiration and encouragement, and I really appreciate that. And there's a lot, to use the phrase that you mentioned earlier, there's a lot that I learned when I was today years old from you. And so thank you again. I hope the listeners enjoyed this. I hope they feel the same way I do about this conversation. And until next time, Amber.
Thank you very much.